Hello, good afternoon. Today, our guest is Professor Steve Pincus. Hello, Professor Pincus. How are you doing?
Fine. How are you?
I'm
Nice to meet you.
great. Yes, so I'm finally getting the opportunity to meet the brilliant Steve Pincus. All right,
Well,
then.
that's,
Yeah, I see that you're quite humble. You're not even responding.
yeah, well, it's a bit embarrassing. Yeah.
Yes. These academics and the people I interview, they just can't take a compliment. Yeah, so Steve, today we're going to be talking about empires. What is an empire?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and something which is broadly debated. I'm in favor of a kind of minimalist definition of empire. An empire is a kind of state which governs over a variety of people, but makes no claim that the people should in any way be homogeneous. So there's an empire. At the heart of any governance of empire is the notion of difference, that there are a variety of different peoples, perhaps different ethnicities, perhaps different religions, perhaps different races, perhaps certainly different languages that can be all governed by a single state. So at the heart of the definition of empire, to distinguish it from a nation state, is that there's no notion that the people can be, should be, or might be homogeneous in any sort of way. So a nation state posits the notion that there's a single nationality that is exactly congruous with the areas governed by the state.
Why should we study empires?
Well, I think that there's two good reasons to study empires. One is that uh, over the course of human history, the most long-lasting political form, the one that existed over the longest course of human history, has been empire. So it's in many ways the most normal form of human government. The second is that while we tend to think in the 21st century, we tend to think of empires as a term of abuse, as an old-fashioned, archaic form. In many ways, both positively and negatively, many current polities approximate empires. That is to say, govern over a variety of different sorts of peoples and don't just insist on any kind of homogeneity. So while I would not want to call, because of the associations of it, I wouldn't want to call the European Union an empire. It's certainly, the European Union certainly looks a lot more like an empire than it does like a nation state.
Professor Pincus, I'm going to ask a question that is quite simple, but political scientists rarely explore it. Are all empires imperial?
Well, yeah, it depends what you mean by the term imperial.
Let me explain what I
Yeah,
mean. The British
yeah.
Empire, that empire was an imperial empire. The American Empire, to some extent, is an imperial empire, but the Chinese Empire was a powerful empire. But many non-European empires don't need to wage war against people outside of their region. They can accumulate a large landmass within a particular continent or geographical location. That's why I'm asking the question: are all empires imperial?
Well, I mean, my sense is, and this is perhaps a controversial view, is that all states to some degree are imperial in the sense that they appropriate, either through conquest or other means, other regions, other peoples, to sort of and expand the area in which they govern. So, for example, we tend to think of, I mean, just stereotypically, right, in common parlance, we tend to think of France, for example, as a stereotypical nation state, right? But of course, France in the hexagon itself, not to even think about the so-called département, Guadeloupe, Martinique, etc. In France itself, they govern over Breton, people from Brittany, over Basques, over people in the Languedoc who speak, whose language is, at the very least, a dialect. And so obviously over time, over the Middle Ages and the early modern period, France expanded its sovereignty over those areas and compelled people to speak French, as opposed to, Basque or Breton in schools, for example. So it strikes me that all states to some degree are imperial. And so even when one thinks about China, I mean, my former colleague and good friend, Peter Bourdieu, wrote an important book called China Marches West, which demonstrates the way in which China got bigger in part through conquest and part through expansion. Now, so in that sense, I think all empires are imperial, and I think you could make the same case for the Mughal Empire, if they were the Ottoman Empire, et cetera, that they always expanded in some way or another. However, I mean, I think it is fair to say that most empires in human history, their expansion has been over contiguous polities. What was, unusual about the British Empire or the Spanish Empire was precisely the overseas nature of that empire. But I'm not sure that that means that those empires are imperial in a way that the Chinese or the Ottoman Empire wasn't imperial. I think they're all imperial. They all expand. Again, for me, the biggest distinction is that while the French state expanded over time, and obviously at various moments sort of conceived of itself as an empire, the France in the hexagon, at least, insisted on an ideology of homogeneity. Both mapped onto, in the period before the French Revolution, mapped onto a notion of empire, of monarchy, and after the French Revolution, mapped onto notions of republic. But it always insisted on the fundamental sameness of the French people, even though we know that France was not homogeneous, that there were, to say nothing of obviously people who were, who live in France now who are Muslim or who come from Africa, et cetera, but even Europeans, right? There was a big difference between people who's in the Ile-de-France who spoke classic French versus the people in Brittany who spoke Breton.
Professor Pincus, the nation state is quite recent, and I'm happy that you're discussing the case of France, because many, well, I shouldn't say many, but I'm guessing that the average person, or maybe some academics, do not remember that it was really the French Revolution that popularized the nation state in France.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that that's right. And I think, my own view is that people were experimenting with notions of nation in the 17th and 18th century before the French Revolution, but I completely agree with you that the whole notion of the nation state is a very recent phenomenon. It's a 19th century phenomenon, and maybe an early 20th century phenomenon, and obviously something like an idea of the League of Nations, to think about, Woodrow Wilson's, a cherished concept, was, people didn't think in those terms, certainly before the 19th century, and obviously couldn't instantiate it until the 20th century. But the nation state is a very recent term, and I would go so far to say that the nation state has always been an aspiration. It's never actually been achieved.
Why would you say this?
Because I think it's very difficult to think of any state that's actually homogeneous. That there are no differences in terms of dialect, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion. There are always minorities, and as much as we might want to aspire to to a single nationality. If nationality is given any kind of cultural significance as opposed to legal significance, that is to say, I mean, I sort of do accept that there's a difference between a civic conception of nationhood versus a sort of ethnic one. If it does have cultural significance, then it's never been achieved, because there's every place one can imagine, there are different kinds of people. They might be a minority, but there's no people that have all share the same histories, etc. So I do think that nation is always an aspiration. The sort of homogeneity is always sort of aspirational, and there are always going to be minorities in one way or another. And in that sense, I think every state that exists today shares a great deal with empires. That is to say, empires, because empires insist on the reality of difference and work out how to govern different peoples. Most states actually look like empires in that sort of way. Now, obviously, what I'm saying is part of the way that we've thought about empires has been problematic because it's been normative rather than analytical. That is to say, we tend to think about, we ask questions, are empires good things or empires bad things? And that strikes me as the wrong question to be asking. I think the question is, can we talk about something analytically as an empire as distinct from a nation state? And if we can do that, then we accept that empires like nation states, like any sort of polity, might run a spectrum from more democratic to less democratic, more authoritarian, less authoritarian, more oppressive, less oppressive, and to be perfectly honest, throughout history, most empires, just like most states, have tended to be more oppressive, less democratic. That's just the way most polities have been throughout human history. But it's not their empire-ness that makes them more oppressive. Their empire-ness just simply is a way of sort of recognizing difference.
Steve, and I'm asking this question as a layman who follows academic research. Do we know the right constellation to induce empires? What I'm basically saying is this: are empires driven by a demand for resources? Do people form empires because internally demographic challenges are becoming a problem and as such they need to expand? What's the motivation behind an empire?
So look, my own view is, look, there's a spectrum of possibilities which lead to expansion. And I don't think there's a one size fits all answer. However, that said, I do think in most cases, empires are driven by broadly based political economic ideologies. That is to say, in my view, in most cases over human history, empires have tried to solve some kind of economic problem. Whether the economic problem is trying to get enough raw materials to be able to survive autochthonously, that is to say, to not depend on uncertain imports from other polities, or whether so that's been one motivation. So certainly in early human history, one can see imperial expansion as an attempt to get the wherewithal to feed a population. In other cases, it's been, there's been some interesting and important work, for example, on the Ottoman Empire, that basically said, in some cases, it looks like imperial expansion was a way to avoid environmental degradation. That yes, one could, for example, irrigate certain areas to be able to grow grain there, but the cost in terms of environmental harm. In some cases, the expansion of disease, et cetera, was very high, that imperial expansions tended to solve those sorts of problems. Or in the case of there's some reason to believe some European expansion was trying to deal with the problem of deforestation in Europe, for example. So I do think that in the majority of cases in human history, empire was an attempt to solve an economic problem. Now, having said that, I want to give you two caveats. Caveat number one is, when I say in most cases, I'm sure one could point to individual cases where empire was driven simply by the greed, lust for power, lust for glory of an individual. And that's one caveat. But the sort of larger caveat, which I would say, is that to say that empires are frequently driven by an attempt to solve an economic problem doesn't mean that everybody over human history understood economic problems in the same way. And so in many empires, there was a fight of that, while everybody would agree that in a particular polity, that the goal of the empire was to promote prosperity, for example, they would disagree over what means what were the best means to promote prosperity, even within a given empire.
Steve, would you describe America as an empire?
So let me give you, obviously, in the current moment, that particular debate has, shall we say, ideologically charged significance, because I think most people, when they say, oh, is America an empire, because we know our empires are A, archaic, and B, bad things, that if one says that America is an empire, one is necessarily offering some kind of political critique. That said, and I obviously reject that view because I have a much more broad-based definition of empire. That said, to my mind, there's no question that America is an empire. America governs over a variety of different people, of different ethnicities, different cultures, different religions. There's no question that America, to my mind, that is an empire. And there's no question, and I think to my mind, however one understands American federalism, and I know that legal scholars debate this very much, to simply posit the notion that America is a federation of states, however much power you give to individual states, is to accept that there is difference. That is to say, each state has some different laws than other states, which means that by definition, America is definitely an empire. And I think, I don't think there's any other way to see that. Now, I think there's a different question, which I might not be, completely prepared to answer, which is, should one think of, American sovereignty over, say, Puerto Rico or Guam? Is that some kind of colonial relationship? Well, that's a different question, because that's a question of the nature of autonomy that those places have, which is a different question. But I think there's no question in my mind that America is an empire, just like there's no question in my mind, and this is obviously very controversial, that China is an empire.
All right, but Steve, now I'm going to offer a response that could be quite baffling. Yes, we're arguing that America is an empire, but is the American empire guided by these same philosophical heuristics? For instance, the French had a policy of assimilation, and we're quite familiar with the cultural policies of the British Empire. Is the American empire also a cultural and philosophical empire, or is America just a great power that intervenes in specific states to advance its own objectives?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and it's a very good question, because it strikes me that there's no consensus among American politicians, I mean, if put that way, that is to say, I think that there are some people who would say, of course, America promotes a certain set of cultural values, and to be an American means, you know, accepting those cultural values, whereas others would say no. What the United States is fundamentally defined by a set of laws and legal principles. And political institutions, and in that sense, there's no attempt to assimilate. The argument is that as long as people accept the laws and institutions, then it doesn't matter whether they're a Muslim or a Zoroastrian, black, white, brown, etc. They're all equally American. Or if their first language is Spanish or Hmong or Korean or whatever, as long as they're willing to follow American laws and accept the authority of American political institutions, they're American. So I think, and now those questions I think are deeply contested in American politics today, there isn't a universally accepted ideology of assimilation in the US. It's something which is very heavily contested. Just like, I would say it was something which was very heavily contested in 18th century Britain. So the answer, it's a very good question that you ask, and I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm simply suggesting that the question is one where you would get a different answer depending on, what politician you would ask to answer that question.
American imperialism serves to avert geopolitical threat. So when you study the role of America in the Caribbean, Latin America, and even Africa, it becomes evident that America, yes, is promoting a set of values that are Euro-American. These values form part of the Euro-American civilization, not necessarily the American civilization, because America was once under British rule. So America would have inherited many of the policies of the British, and America, the early immigrants were predominantly European and white. So America, in a sense, is an exponent of Western civilization. And as a superpower, America must pursue policies that minimize risk. But from the position of empire building and being an imperialist power, I don't perceive America to be a philosophical empire. It's based on real politique.
Yeah, so look, I think that that's a fair description of some American policies. I think that, one could make the claim that, for example, during the Cold War, American interventions in places like El Salvador were understood as philosophically motivated. That is to say, to prevent one kind of governance in favor of another kind of governance. But I think. So I think that there, my own view is that this is something which has always been heavily contested in America as it was in Britain. And there, I think I completely agree with you that there's a certain, that the kind of debates about what kind of an empire Britain was going to be have translated almost exactly into American politics. I think there's a lot of continuity, but I think it's unclear. I think at some moments, some politicians sound like they think American intervention internationally is to promote a particular kind of value, whereas I think at other moments, I think American interventions internationally are seen much more minimalist. That is to say, not not to promote a particular kind of value, but to promote the possibilities of difference and different kinds of values. So I think at different moments, different politicians in American history have acted differently. I don't think there's a single unifying principle so I think it's useful to think about empires on a continuum, that some empires in human history have tended towards a cultural assimilation on in one sort of value. So while I think that there's, for example, to give you one concrete example, what I mean by this is that the Spanish Empire in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century absolutely insisted that it was a Catholic empire. Now that said, within that, there was a lot of room for difference, for ethnic difference, for religious, ethnic difference, for linguistic difference, et cetera, within the empire. But there was this kind of project of Catholicization. My colleagues my friends and colleagues who work on the Spanish Empire would obviously point out that there was not an insistence on a particular kind of Catholicism throughout the period, but nevertheless, that was one sort of value. So that's, one place on the spectrum. And I think another sort of place on the spectrum is, the description that Herodotus gives us of the Persian Empire, where all that the Persians cared about was extending, insisting that various polities recognize their inferiority to the Persian King of Kings, but didn't change anything, etc. There was no cultural change. So I think there's a broad spectrum of beliefs, and I think what's important of empires over human history. But I think what's important to realize with America, just like it's in Britain, that what the empire actually was and what its relationship to difference was always highly contested, and was a political football, which in many times defined partisan debate in both polities.
Yeah, the history of empire building is quite controversial. The Aztec Empire was an extractive empire, but it was not a culturally significant empire either. When the Aztecs conquered different groups, they often encouraged them to keep their policies, or they would incorporate the official policy with local policies. And as a result of this practice, revolts and riots were the norm.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right to say that over human history, there have been different empires which have adopted different policies. That some empires, all they cared about was extracting resources from the places that they conquered. Other than that, the local people could do whatever they wanted, and in other cases they argued for more assimilation. What I will say is, in the British case, and I think to some degree in the American case, one of the things that was always central to what the empire was that it was always something which was publicly debated, and that is to say, it was what the point of the empire has always been something which has been debated in the press, which has been debated, in Parliament in Britain, in Congress in the United States, in learned books, and in everyday discourse. And I think that very publicness of the imperial discussion, which was somewhat different from most empires in human history, created both a possibility for a greater possibility for economic dynamism, because I think it made it possible for information to come in about the economic conditions in various parts of the empire in ways that places where there was less public debate made it much harder. So I think on the one hand, it led to much more to a possibility of economic dynamism, and on the other hand, it led to greater possibility of political resistance and political debate. And I think one of the interesting facts about the British Empire, which I'm more comfortable talking about perhaps than the American Empire, because that's where my research is that at moments where the British Empire suppressed the circulation of political information were moments where the economies did not go very well. So, for example, in India in the 18th century, right after gaining control of Bengal, the British East India Company tried to suppress the circulation of political information and political discussion, and the consequence was the Great Bengal Famine of 1768 to 1771, where 3 to 10 million people died. And I think there was a similar attempt to suppress political discussion in Ireland in the 19th century, which played some role in the Irish famine. And this is a point that was made, has been made by the great economist Amartya Sen.
Yeah, and they're also because you're talking about the American Empire. I'm not an expert in the history of the Roman Empire myself, but based on what I have read and empirical studies, there are some striking analogies between the Roman Empire and the American Empire. The American Empire, as you rightly noted earlier, exported a set of norms and institutions, and that was also one of the objectives of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is an early example of the globalizing power of imperial building, of empire building.
No, I mean, and I think that's, there's no question, and here that you're absolutely right. I mean, here I'm thinking about the work of my colleague Cliff Ando, has pointed out not only sort of institution building, but sort of a set of ideology of empire, which was promulgated in the Roman Empire. I think that that's absolutely right. That there was these kind of institution and ideology building in the Roman Empire. And I think that institution building has been, a central element of at least of British and, to what I know of an American practice to some degree. Nevertheless, those institutions don't necessarily imply cultural conformity.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Especially for the Roman Empire, George Tridemus, yet a new paper on religion in the Roman Empire, quite excellent. And he's basically, did you read it?
No, I didn't read that, but I think it's absolutely the case that, obviously there's religious pluralism in the Roman Empire.
Exactly. This is the point I want to elucidate. The Romans were invested in religion, but they were not emotionally invested in a state religion.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, until obviously, yes, late in the Roman Empire, but yes, that's absolutely right. And that is, that's a very important point. Yeah. So there was a sense in which the Roman Empire, what was important was a set of institutions, a set of political practices, a set of laws. Absolutely, Roman law was central to all of this, but not cultural homogeneity.
The French, they represent the best example of a cultural empire, because wherever the French went, they were serious about ensuring that the elites appropriated French practices.
Yeah, that's absolutely right ideologically. Recent work on French Africa has pointed out how there was some tension, right? That there was some, and this was true, in Algeria too, that there was absolutely, they wanted to make the elites French, but there was a limit in how French, perhaps some people thought they could be, and certainly this was true in Algeria as well. The question which one has to ask is whether the ideology of which I think was absolutely central in many ways, to what extent the ideology of of cultural Frenchification, if you will, was actually practiced on the ground. That is to say, to what extent were there limits to what the French were willing to do? Were they willing to sort of say that somebody from Senegal, properly educated, could become fully French, or could they become only somewhat French? And I think there's scholars debate this right now.
And many scholars are also rethinking the influence of the Spanish Empire. There's a new argument asserting that the Spanish Empire is overrated, in the sense that it lacked the capacity to truly be imperial. So as students of history, we're often told that the Spanish Empire was the original extractive empire, but modern research is suggesting that yes, it was extractive, but it also lacked capacity.
Right. And so there's some recent work. I'm thinking of a paper by Regina Graffa and Alejandra Irigoyen, who've emphasized that that in fact the amount of cash transfers really happening, at least from Spanish America to European Spain, was less than we thought. That there's actually that its capacity really to extract was less than it was. And the argument.
What's the name? Pronounce the names of these academics again, or just tell me the name of the people.
Regina Graffa, so she Grafe, and Alejandra Irigoyen, Irigoyin. I think that's extremely plausible. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter is, all of that, I think there's a lot of plausibility, but nevertheless, there's no question that that silver from Peru and Mexico was extracted from those places, was in the first instance transferred to Spain, and in the larger instance, obviously transferred very much to the east, to China, largely to trade. So I think there's a certain level of extraction which did take place, but I think it's very important to realize, and again, empires, like nation states, we tend to, my view is that there's different economic policies that different kinds of empires do. Some are more extractive, some are less extractive or more redistributive. But I think it's always important to realize that just as nation states try to paint an imagined picture of themselves as culturally homogeneous, so do the ways which we describe empires as, as extractive. We tend to sort of overemphasize, I think, the extent of extraction and the ability to extract. I think there were always, institutional limitations, that, there was only, the capacity to extract was always limited by the various technologies of governance available at the time.
The institutional pillars of empire building, the Spanish, they were the first mover in empire building. Sorry, I keep saying imperial. So the Spanish represent the original extractive empire. The British and other Europeans would have designed more effective mechanisms to create and extract wealth, especially the British. The British for centuries have had an institutional advantage.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that with respect to European, or at least post-Roman European empires, the Spanish were innovators, right? Their model was definitely one focused on the extraction. Here I completely agree with Adam Smith, focused on the extraction of precious metals, right? That they were motivated, that was what was going on. I think at different times, the British were less motivated by extraction, but at other times they were absolutely. There's no question in my mind that to take the example of Jamaica, I mean, the whole point of having a colony in Jamaica was to
Extract
grow
wealth.
sugar and extract wealth from that sugar. Yes, absolutely. But you could argue that, for example, there was no wealth to be extracted from New England. I mean, what did New England have? You can't grow sugar, you can't grow tobacco. There was no precious metals. That the model for governing New England, for example, was somewhat different, and the focus there was on consumers, on consumption of British manufactured goods, at least in the 17th and 18th centuries. So again, I mean, part of my point is that in the British Empire in the 17th and 18th century, there were those who very much wanted an extractive empire and looked up in the first instance to the Spanish model and then to what they saw as an improved Spanish model in France. And there were others who thought, no, we should organize empire in a very different way with a different set of economic policies. So I do think, I mean, that was heavily contested. And there's no question in my mind that those who were most interested in governing in the West Indies were the most extractive.
I agree. The British Empire in the Caribbean was extractive, but Caribbean countries, in particular Jamaica, on the eve of independence, inherited a strong state because the British were big on both government institutions and civic institutions.
Yes, that's true. And I think it's important. I mean, even in, I mean, one of the remarkable things about Jamaica in the 17th and 18th centuries was precisely that there was an assembly in Jamaica and elections of the assembly took place every 2 years, and up until 1762 free blacks in Jamaica could vote, so it was a relatively I mean, obviously the vast majority of Jamaicans were enslaved people who couldn't vote, but there were these kind of robust political institutions that were established by the British Empire. So absolutely, they inherited those relatively robust institutions. I mean, obviously I was emphasizing the assembly, but obviously there were legal institutions as well.
Jamaica was also one of the first adopters of industrial technology in the Americas. The Falmouth Water Company. Yeah, Aaron Graham has an excellent paper on the topic.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And that, and there's been some work also by both Aaron and Nuala Zahedieh have begun to move in that direction. Yes.
Yes. But since we're on the issue, and before I continue, I must say that at one point in Jamaican history, there was actually an institution similar to the Royal Society in London.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so the British were really big on institutions, but we're on empire building and on the British. So you produce a paper titled "The Rise and Fall of Empires," an essay in economic and political liberty. And your thesis is that if empires are serious about progressing, they're going to be liberal.
Yes, I mean, I just have a sort of simple, a simple theory there, and that is that in the long run, empires survive as long as most people living in the empire think that they will be better off inside the empire than outside the empire. So to put this in very simple terms, in America, what happened was the balance shifted. I mean, up until the 1760s, most people in North America, or at least most white people who could vote in North America, thought that the British Empire was good for them. And in the 1760s and 1770s, they tended to think it wasn't good for them. And there's a certain sense that you could even extend this story to a place like Jamaica, where the majority of the population was enslaved, because one of the key factors, I think, in maintaining British imperial control in Jamaica was precisely that after the so-called First Maroon War, the Maroons and the British government had sort of achieved a kind of accommodation where I think most Maroons thought this kind of accommodation with British governance was to their advantage. Now, obviously, all of that changed in the late 18th century when Balcarres broke all of the promises that had been made to the Maroons. But I think it's useful to sort of think about empires as surviving as long as most people in the empire think that they're better off inside the empire than outside the empire. And I do tend to think that in most cases, the most important ways of thinking about whether or not they're better off or not better off are largely material and economic.
Exactly. Steve, Jamaica. Is it possible for an academic to not be interested in Jamaica?
No, I think not. I think Jamaica is an incredibly fascinating place.
Exactly.
I think that, I think anybody interested in empire, well, obviously in the Caribbean more broadly, but also anybody interested in the British Empire, Jamaica is absolutely fascinating. And I wish more people were interested in it.
Yeah.
I find it,
It's just
it's full of all of the contradictions, tensions, but also the potentials. So it's very exciting.
It's just like Raffles, Stafford Raffles, who basically developed Singapore. He was born in Jamaica.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jamaica has been producing distinguished citizens for centuries.
Yes, no, that's right. Yeah. And it's very interesting. I mean, one thinks of, obviously I'm somebody who thinks that the 18th century is somewhat important. It's very interesting that, the ideology, I mean, if William Pitt the Elder was perhaps the most important prime minister of 18th century Britain, his chief advisor in the 18th century was a Jamaican, a man by the name of William Beckford, who started life as a planter. I mean, obviously
Yes,
one of the
the Beckford, the name is
Jamaica.
popular in Jamaica.
Yes, yeah.
Wow,
absolutely.
So, and in your second paper, Rethinking Mercantilism, you produce a novel argument, well, novel for some of us, and you're contending that the British Empire was reflective and self-critical.
Yes.
Mercantilism, were legislators in favor of mercantilism, or were legislators more likely to critique mercantilism?
Well, I think both. I think this is precisely, I mean, my point in that paper is that that the notion that political economic debate was something that only started in the 19th century is deeply problematic. That from the 17th century onwards, at least, in Britain, there was a very lively debate about how to understand the relationship between state and economy. And yes, there absolutely were classic people who sort of fit the classic model of mercantilism, that the state should govern the economy, that the state should extract wealth in various forms, and should use the power of the state to do this, and were in favor of various tariff barriers, et cetera, to protect trade. But I think there were also people who thought that the state should act very differently with respect to the economy, that the state shouldn't be extractive, they came from there were some people who believed that the amount of wealth in the world was finite and was determined by the amount of land in the world, and those people look like classic mercantilists. But there were another set of people who thought, well, no, the amount of wealth in the world is potentially infinite, and the limitation is only human ingenuity and human labor. And that's obviously the position of somebody like John Locke. And Locke said that if you think about the amount of wealth in the world, 99% of the amount of wealth in the world is generated by human activity, human labor, human ingenuity, and therefore wealth is potentially infinite. And in that model, the goal of the state is to promote human is to promote human ingenuity and human activity to to stimulate growth, not to extract wealth. So over the course of the 17th and 18th century, I think there was a profound debate about how best to govern the empire. And I think here, and there was no agreement. I mean, British politicians, took some politicians took one side in this debate and some politicians took another side. So the argument that I'm trying to make is that in the 17th and 18th century, in Britain at least, but I'd be willing to push this more broadly throughout Europe, but in Britain at least, I'm quite confident in saying that there was no so-called mercantilist consensus. There were some people who looked like the mercantilists, that Eli Heckscher famously wrote about, but there were other people who looked very differently.
Yes, and this is why I really enjoy both of your papers. So in the first paper, The Rise and Fall of Empires, you share with us the critiques of the Grenville of the Grenville reforms. So
Right.
Grenville was an official who supported protectionist policies, but his critics
Exactly.
argue that wealth creation is not a zero-sum game, and Britain actually grew in wealth when colonies did well.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so, right. So increasingly there was, and this was a debate really from the late 17th century onwards about whether the goal of British government with respect to the empire was to promote the prosperity of the entire empire, which meant, and increasingly over the course of the 18th century, the idea was that the most dynamic parts of the British imperial economy were not in England, certainly, but elsewhere in the empire, so that they should, have the colonies do well economically. Whereas in others, like Grenville, believed that Britain and its empire only prospered when England did well, and therefore that meant extracting wealth from the empire.
And the British also imposed immense pressure on countries in the Americas and Africa to eliminate their internal slave trades, basically.
That's right. Yes, at various moments. That's exactly right. I mean, and again, I mean, this is, lamentable or not, depending on the way you think about it, but there was a lively debate about slavery and the slave trade in Britain well before abolitionism. That debate was not largely on moral grounds. So, the moral critique of slavery has existed time out of mind. I mean, why, if we're all God's creatures, why should anybody and one human being be able to enslave another, right? I mean, that kind of moral critique has always existed. But what happened in the 17th and 18th century in Britain was a profound economic critique of slavery and the slave trade. And the argument with respect to, the Caribbean and North America was, the argument against slavery was that slave societies are not consumer societies, because no plantation owner worth his or her salt is going to buy, a slave a new set of clothes every 2 or 3 weeks to keep up with the fashions, or is going to, give them, new tools or whatever. I mean, that's simply not the incentives of a planter. So slave societies are not good consumer societies, and the best way for an economy to grow is a sort of a dynamic interplay between producers and consumers. So slave societies were bad on those grounds. And the second argument that they made was a sociological argument, that slave societies tended to become increasingly oligarchical societies. That is to say, extractive slave societies like Jamaica, there was huge incentives to create very, very large sugar plantations, and to sort of for the large sugar planters to eat out or to outcompete the small sugar planters. And that meant that you would have an increasingly oligarchical society with fewer and fewer consumers. So there was this economic argument against slavery in North America and in the Caribbean. They also, at the same time, came up with an economic argument against slavery in the enslavement of peoples in Africa. And the argument increasingly went, and this is associated with some political economists of the 18th century, like Malachi Postlethwaite,
Yes,
that
he's always cited by people who are
yes,
critical of capitalism.
yeah. So I mean, they point out that, you know, giving incentives to enslave people in Africa perverted African societies in a variety of ways. That instead of producing goods, they became heavily militarized societies, and that inhibited economic development or economic growth in Africa. So in the 18th century, there was a profound economic critique within Britain of slavery and the slave trade. Now, obviously, I mean, I think it's very important to note that there was also economic defenses of slavery and the slave trade. But my point in these papers is that there was debate. That's all that I'm trying to say, that there was no mercantilist consensus. And therefore, we can't really talk about, you know, an age of mercantilism in the 17th and 18th century, followed by an age of free trade in the 19th and 20th century. In both periods, there are people who argue for more free trade and others for more barriers. It's a political debate, and the terms of that political debate, to be perfectly honest, have changed very little between, you know, 1650 and the 21st century. It's just the political balance has shifted in various places.
All right, so we're wrapping up, but before we wrap up, we must make it explicitly clear. This conversation is really about the ethics of empire, and this is the last question, and I'm expecting you to be quite brief. Would you affirm the argument, or I should not say affirm the argument, but would you consider the argument that empires can be the harbinger of modernity, postulated by people like Deepak Lala?
Yeah. I find it difficult to answer that question because obviously
I don't need a long response. It's just a brief response. I just want to know what you think about it.
So my answer is that empires have existed throughout human history, and there have been empires which were absolutely not modern, and there have been empires that were modern. So just like I find it difficult to say whether empires are good or bad things, I don't think it's possible to say whether the harbingers of modernity. I think empires were states which created various positions. I would say, if I were to say what the harbinger of modernity was, I would say it was the encounter between East and West, which really happened in the late 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. That sort of shocked the world into thinking about the world, as a globe. And that, for me, was the harbinger of modernity.
All right. So I really enjoy our conversation, but unfortunately, I have to wrap up. But speaking to you has been awesome, Steve. Bye.
It's been great talking to you. Bye-bye.
All right, then. Bye.